short note first, for context. Abdyl Banushi is a real historical figure linked in sources to anti-communist exile networks and to an attempted operation against Enver Hoxha around the big November 29, 1974 parade. He was captured and imprisoned in Albania afterwards. Balkanweb +1, now the story. Told like a chronicle. Imagining what happens if he succeeded. The day the mountain fell prologue. It was a day the state had planned as spectacle and proof. On November 29, 1974, the terraces were full. The banners tidy, the brass shining like promise. Enver stood on the rostrum like a cliff. His face carved into the hard certainty of decades. Albania expected to see him salute and the people to cheer. No one had expected a single thin thread of defiance to cut through that certainty and change the script of history. In this world, the thread held Abdyl Banushi, trained in exile and returned by forces that believed the old regime must end, moved through the crowd like a shadow with a single purpose. The shot rang, Hoxha fell. The applause froze into silence. Where the people had planned to see their marshal, they saw the long shape of a fallen oak. Chapter 1, The Night of Smoke. In the panic that followed, the palace burned with urgent lights and the secret police moved like wolves. Some leaders fled to safe rooms. Others vanished into the folds of the state where loyalty had always been currency. The inner circle tried to patch the wound with announcements and slogans. They bound the body, closed the parade, called for calm. But the calm was a thin skin over a fever. Without the marshal's iron presence, the party fractured into rival currents. The head of state security demanded harsh reprisal. The young generals wanted order by force. The technocrats whispered of negotiation and caution. In the alleys of Tirana, ordinary people looked up at the empty podium and wondered what would come next. Banushi did not live to see the long aftermath. He was captured amid the confusion, dragged into interrogations and cells. Some called him a traitor, others a liberator. He never gave the simple answer they wanted. The men and women who believed in him called him a lantern that had been born to burn. The state called him an assassin who would be made an example of. Both names fit the moment. Chapter 2, The Spider Web of Power. When a lightning bolt strikes a mountain, the aftershocks take strange paths. Within the party, the old hand who had been seen but never openly named as heir tried to gather the factions. A cruel succession of purges began, then stalled. Rumors swirled that the state security had been compromised by foreign handlers. The Soviets leaned in with advice and wagging eyebrows. The West smelled opportunity and sent cautious envoys. There was no single autumn of reconciliation. There was instead a slow, nervous dance. Some officers refused to fire on crowds. Some local officials who had felt safe in the system found themselves negotiating bread and
coal for citizens who now shouted in the streets. The terror that Hoxha had perfected began to lose its certainty, simply because the man who had embodied it was gone. In the provinces, old rivalries rose up for air. In the cities, students and workers, hungry for words other than slogans, began to whisper of reform. They were careful at first, then impatient. The party tried to hold the old script, rewriting it with the name of a new leader. The people rewrote it with songs. Chapter the 3rd, The Long Winter of the State. Years do not heal the sudden removal of a dictator. They reveal choices. One faction tried to reconstitute the old terror with show trials and mass arrests. Another faction, led by technocrats, who had always wanted trade and training, rather than endless purges, tried to open the shutters. Those in the middle, exhausted and pragmatic, tilted toward caution. In this version of Albania, the cautious faction won the early years. They kept the security organs intact but replaced the most zealous cadres with men who remembered how to count budgets and how to negotiate with foreign ministers. The first timid thaw arrived. In the late 1970s, grain shipments came in exchange for modest reforms. A television program showed a debate with more than one voice. It felt like someone had opened a long sealed window. Banushi remained in custody, a living symbol. In the prisons he was spoken of with equal parts hatred and reverence. He became a name people invoked when they argued about whether violence could ever be excused for liberty. He became a ghost in the corridors of state memory. Chapter 4, The Year of Return. By the early 1980s, Diplomatic channels were a maze of polite letters and hidden overtures. A neighbouring state that had once been an ideological rival now offered to host technicians and students. Exiles were allowed to visit family for the first time in decades. Small markets sprung up where farmers could trade for imported tools. The cultural thaw widened into a brittle spring. In time, the new leadership realized the old model was unsustainable. They could keep the drums and the slogans, but they could not keep the border closed and the factories falling apart. Slowly, carefully, they opened ports to limited foreign capital and invited engineers to teach in the polytechnics. The hardliners complained. The young said it had taken too long. It is in these years that Banushi's legend shifted. The prisoner became a martyr figure for some, a villain for others. After decades behind walls, he emerged as a weathered man with a quick dark smile, allowed a staged release as part of a broader amnesty. He did not call for revenge. He called, in interviews that trembled with the memory of the day, for an Albania that could feed its children and recall its dead without blood for blood. Chapter 5. The mirror of neighbors. The Balkans watched. Yugoslavia, always cautious, sent delegations to discuss trade and to test what the new Tirana meant. For the first time since the early years after the war, an Albanian minister sat across a table and spoke freely of joint infrastructure, river projects, and transported goods. The old paranoia eased, replaced by mutual interest. In time, Albania joined a regional grain exchange and opened ports that had long been under state control. Return of exiles boosted the workforce. The economy did not boom like a fantasy, but it moved. A generation born under terror now had passports for study abroad. The price of that movement was compromise. The men who had held power kept a place at the table. They guarded the archives and the secrets. They retained the security apparatus and used it in ways that changed slowly, not instantly. Old wrongs were never truly unmade. Families still counted their dead. The scars on Tirana's brickwork were not paved over. Epilogue: the long shadow. What would historians say if the Marshal had died the way he did in this story? They would speak of a regime that fractured earlier, of a country that opened itself more quickly to the world, and of a man who pulled a trigger and turned the course of a nation. Some would call Banushi a criminal. Some would call him a catalyst for change. Both voices would build the memory of a single day. In the end, Albania in this timeline becomes something like a long, slow reconciliation. Not a clean liberal paradise, nor a perfect justice. The state remains strong, but less absolute. Citizens learn to argue in public places. Students travel abroad. The markets hum. And the old men who once chanted loyalty in the piazzas grow silent and occasionally reflective. And in the quiet of a prison yard, the man whose act had split a nation sits with his head bent and watches swallows writing lines over the sky. He has changed history. He has not erased pain. The country that grows after him is both lighter and darker for it, shaped by the fact that one shot, in a morning of flags and music, became a turning point the world would debate for generations.